Does the Bible really claim there was a worldwide flood? Or was the story of Noah and the ark just allegory, a story to teach us some profound lesson? If there had been a global flood, we should see evidence of this, shouldn't we? Maybe you have a friend or family member who's wondered about the flood of Noah. We're about to answer these questions and more. You should call them up and tell them you're watching this special edition of Genesis Week. And a welcome to this episode of Genesis Week, the weekly program of creationary commentary on news, views, and events pertaining to the origins, controversy, excellence, and pirate broadcasting. This week, our secret agent at Miracle Channel hooked into the transmitter when no one was looking, and we're broadcasting from the old abandoned hydroelectric station at the bottom of Niagara Falls. Just ignore the rumbling you hear in the background. We continue to bring you the information the anti-creationists don't want you to see or hear, and giving glory to our Creator while doing it. God did not say, "Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy mindlessness," but rather we here at Genesis Week believe God gave you a brain for a reason, and we want to use our brains to find the truth along with you. Remember, if you get lost in cyberspace, just punch in wazulu.com or genesisweek.com. You will find us, and you can subscribe to our YouTube channel and get extras like Crevo rants and interviews with our guests. I'm your host, Ian Juby. It can be quite an educational surprise to find out what probably is the most contentious story in the Bible. It's not what you would expect. It wasn't the claim that Jesus rose from the dead. It's not even the story that's the foundation and primary focus of this show, the creation account. The account that has caused the most debate and arguing in history has been the flood of Noah. Even Discovery Channel has taken on the debate. Now, we must first address what it is exactly that the Bible says in order to assess the flood account. For example, a documentary on Discovery Channel claimed that Noah's flood was just a local flood. Well, let's dispel this myth right off the bat. Why would Noah spend at least 100 years of his life building a 450-foot-long ship, collecting 2 of every animal, when all he had to do to escape the flood was climb the nearest hill? He had 100 years to get to higher ground. Secondly, the Bible tells us that the highest mountain was covered by at least 15 cubits of water. So in either case, it was a miracle. Either it was a worldwide flood, or it was a local flood that was higher than the highest mountain. So, the biblical account of the flood of Noah shows that it rained for 40 days and 40 nights, and it's significant that it would appear that Noah's Ark did not float until the 40th day. At the 2003 International Conference on Creationism, Barrick and Sigler analyzed the Hebrew in chapter 7 and the verb sequence of verses 15 to 18 to give a compelling sequence that Noah's Ark did not start floating until the 40th day. This is significant in that most anti-creationists trying to argue against a worldwide flood try to depict Noah's flood as happening overnight, if you will. Now, this is not the case, and its significance will become evident in a moment. The waters continued to rise, with Noah's Ark coming to rest on Mount Ararat on the 150th day. All the mountains under all the heavens were covered by at least 15 cubits of water. Now, that would be around 7 meters or 22 feet of water higher than the highest mountains at the time. Everything on the face of Earth that breathed the breath of life was destroyed. This was not a local flood. Now, obviously, we're not underwater now. So the water receded about 150 days later. This recession event is more significant than people realize, as it would have been the receding floodwaters that carved the major canyons, for example. Now, presently our oceans rise and fall twice a day. Why? The moon and sun pulling on the water, causing tides. So let us ask, would we have tides during a global flood? Well, the answer is yes. In fact, if anything, the tides would have been larger. Right now, our tides stop because the tidal wave hits land. But if the land is submerged, then the tides get bigger and bigger. A resonance develops, and as was modeled by my good friend, the late Professor M.E. Clark, and his student Henry Vaz. So the water encroaching upon the land would have taken weeks to months before the highest points were finally submerged. Now, as this water continually rises, it also has superimposed upon it tidal waves twice a day. So the flood starts, and our first tidal wave hits land, laying down a layer of mud. Now, where the dirt came from was a 1-hour lecture. I won't get into it today. Now, during low tide, the water regresses. Because the water is rising, the next tidal wave is higher than the last, so it lays down a layer of mud on top of the last. During low tide, it regresses. The next tidal wave is higher still, lays down another layer of mud on top of the others, and then low tide sets in. Now, during low tides, you'll have things like dinosaurs walking out on these freshly made tidal flats, trying to get to higher ground, foraging for food, etc. You'll also have people walking around, trying to get to higher ground, etc. Now, all of these creatures will be making footprints in the freshly laid mud, which then gets covered up by another layer of mud from the next tidal wave. Now, during the horrible tsunami of Indonesia in 2004, we learned a lot of things. For example, we learned that one wave can produce multiple layers of sediment. So if there has been a global flood, we should see layers of mud, now hardened into rock, all over the world. This is precisely what we see, and thus we see the first evidence of Noah's flood that I'm sure every person viewing this program has seen. Now, of course, some of these rock layers that we find throughout the world, some evolutionary geologists have contended could not have been laid down by a flood. For example, the Coconino sandstones in Grand Canyon. Now, this is one of the more prominent vertical cliff faces in Grand Canyon, a bright white rock, but when you take a close look at it, it has a highly unusual formation called crossbedding. Now, I'm going to show you pictures of a different formation called the Navajo sandstone because it is brightly colored so you can see the crossbedding better. Within the Navajo, you see the rock layers, but each of these rock layers is composed of these sloped layers called crossbeds. The crossbeds are composed of a top curve called the top set, the slope called the foreset, and the bottom curve that levels out called the bottom set. It is claimed that these are fossil sand dunes from a desert. Now, obviously, we have a problem. If the layers we see in Grand Canyon were laid down by a worldwide flood in 1 year, you cannot have a desert right smack dab in the middle of it all, right? But are these desert dunes? When you actually see the cross-section of a desert dune, it has layers in it that look like crossbeds, but actually the layers conform to the shape of the dune. At White Sands, New Mexico, some of the dunes have crossbedding, but this crossbedding is partly cemented, and actually the winds are destroying these crossbeds, not making them. Furthermore, when we take a look in those cross-bedded layers of the Coconino sandstone, we find fossil footprints. Lots and lots of them. They were made from what appeared to be some kind of lizard or amphibian. Now, there are a number of unusual characteristics of these fossil footprints. For instance, there is no tail drag markings. Now, everyone believes these creatures had a tail, so why did the tail leave no markings in the sand? One logical explanation would be because the sands aren't in a desert, but were underwater and the animal's tail is being buoyed up by the water. This would also explain the fact that the trails of fossil footprints almost always go only uphill, and many of the trails crab track as if the animal was fighting a flow of water trying to walk uphill. Now, in a short distance, the footprints will go from very deep to shallower to claws only to completely disappearing. Did the animal grow wings and fly away? None of this makes sense within the model of desert dunes. However, it makes complete sense if the crossbedding was made underwater. Professor Clark, engineer Andrew Rodenbeck, and myself were conducting experiments in a flume at Creation Evidence Museum in Glen Rose, Texas, a few years ago. Now, a flume is just a big box with clear sides that we run water and dirt through. We found that when we tilted the flume uphill and forced the water to go uphill, the sediments dropped out in the form of crossbeds. It turns out all that needed was standing water. The flow coming in is moving fast enough to pick up and carry the dirt, but when it hits the standing water, it comes to a stop, can no longer hold the sand, and it drops it, much like a continually lengthening conveyor belt. We had Dr. Carl Baugh, director of the museum, get us some amphibians from the pet store, some newts. We placed those in the flume while producing crossbeds and wound up mimicking exactly what we see in the Coconino sandstones. The amphibians tended to recluse themselves to the bottom set as there was an eddy there. To escape, the newts would walk uphill. They would be picked up by the water and swept away. Often they would be swept right back to the bottom set again by the currents. But the clincher came in the form of a presentation at the 2009 Geological Society of America conference by Chung et al. The researchers found dolomite and ooids all throughout the Coconino sandstone. Dolomite and ooids are formed in water, not a desert. So the biblical catastrophe model explains huge formations like the Coconino sandstone far better than any model involving deserts and deep time. But we're taught in school that the rock layers we see around the world are the result of deep time. Millions of years of slow sediment accumulation produced rock layers that we see around the world. Now, there are so many reasons to deny this story that it's difficult to know where to begin, but one easy to understand evidence is polystrate fossils. Polystrate is a term used to describe fossils that are found cutting through multiple rock layers. Poly for many, straight for the strata of rock that it cuts through. Polystrate fossils are literally found all over the world. Joggins, Nova Scotia is probably the most famous example. Now, at any given time, you can usually see 50 polystrate fossils in the fossil cliffs. The fossils there are trunks of giant hollow reeds known as lycopods and calamites. Now, obviously, the top of the plant is not going to stick around while the plant gets slowly buried over even tens of years, let alone thousands or millions, right? So obviously, these layers did not even take tens of years to be laid down, let alone thousands or millions. In fact, this one particular trunk was buried on an angle, which is even more profound evidence that these layers were laid down in rapid succession. Now, this scenario fails to fit the facts on many levels. For example, here we see a fossil root from one of the lycopods. At each of those dimples, a rootlet radiated out from the root. Now, you can see the rootlets in the surrounding rock. Yet, here is one of the stumps at Joggins. Let's take a close-up look at the roots. Notice something missing. The rootlets have been stripped off. Obviously, this plant was ripped up, transported by water, and buried where it now is. It is evidence of catastrophe, not deep time. This stump was buried upside down. Now, last I checked, plants don't grow very well upside down. There were dozens of these upside-down polystrate stumps at a coal mine in Alberta. The Joggins Fossil Cliffs are a mute testament to the greatest catastrophe the world has ever seen. Close to 18,000 vertical feet of rock layers that were obviously laid down in real short order. The layers that do not have polystrate trunks cutting through them are identical to the ones that do. There is no deep time involved here. I go into more detail in my chapter on the Joggins Fossil Cliffs in the book Rock Solid Answers, available through the Creation Research Society. However, the most powerful evidence of Noah's flood probably comes from the incredible erosion that happened as the floodwaters left the land. All around the world, we find strange features that cannot be explained by present-day processes or deep time, but are explained beautifully within the model of a global flood. We find hundreds of water gaps around the world. A water gap is a canyon that was cut by water through a mountain, but the water could have gone around the mountain. Grand Canyon is probably the most famous example of a water gap. It cuts through the Colorado uplift, where it could have gone around the uplift. Now, here in the Rattlesnake Mountains of Wyoming, we see a textbook case of a water gap. A hydroelectric dam was built in the canyon, but yet when you look at the canyon from behind, you see that it has been cut right through the mountain. Yet if you turn to the right, you can see that the water could have gone around the mountain. In fact, when engineers constructed the dam inside the canyon, they had to build a dam at the side of the mountain to keep the water from going around it. Geology experts have noted this weird anomaly that cannot be explained. Experts who have studied these water gaps have acknowledged that these gaps cannot be explained by faults in the rocks, for example. When visiting Grand Canyon, we are told that the mighty Colorado River carved Grand Canyon. Even standing on the shores of the Colorado River, it's not that big. And the fact that the river would have had to have climbed thousands of vertical feet before it could start cutting the canyon tells you there's a problem with the theories involving deep time. However, if there was a worldwide flood, the water is starting above the mountains. And as it picks up speed leaving the land, it will cut through anything in its path, including mountains, even if it could go around the mountain. Planation surfaces are another profound evidence of a worldwide flood. A huge chunk of the mountains on the eastern seaboard of Canada have had their tops planed off flat. Back to Joggins again, you can see the results of slow and steady erosion over the time, as the tides whittle away at the rocks. Now, the rocks that are softer, of course, get eroded away first, and the harder rocks wind up jutting up out of the water. Now, this is called differential erosion. The rocks erode differently. However, take a look at the top of the cliffs. Notice that the same rock layers have been cut off flat. So flat you could stick a ruler on it. There is only one thing that could do that: extremely fast moving water. Water moving so fast that rock hardness did not matter. The East Coast Planation starts in Nova Scotia to the southwest of Cape Breton Highlands. Now, if you can get a good viewing spot, you'll notice that the Cape Breton Highlands are actually a planation surface. They've been planed off flat. Turning around and looking towards Newfoundland, you see the same thing. If you go over to Newfoundland, you'll notice that the mountains there too are planed flat at the same elevation. It's the same planation surface. If you head up to the northern peninsula, all the mountains have been planed off flat. If you head up into Labrador, if the mountain reaches that critical elevation, it's planed flat. This planation surface is huge. It hits the highest elevation around the Corner Brook area, but averages around the 500-meter elevation. Only one thing could do this: extremely fast moving water. Glaciers would not do this, as glaciers by definition flow downhill and carve gouges, not planation surfaces. But in order to cut this rock without being influenced by rock hardness means the water would have had to have been flowing in sheets, moving many tens of kilometers an hour. Quick guess, at least 40 kilometers per hour, bare minimum. This wall of water stretched for over 800 kilometers wide or wider. Now, we watched in horror as tsunamis hit Indonesia in 2004 and Japan in 2011. The massive wall of water moving across the landscape, causing tremendous damage, and yet that water may have hit 25 or 30 kilometers per hour. So how fast was the water that cut the mountains of eastern Canada? Well, to answer this, we'll head to the mountains of western Canada. The Cypress Hills Interprovincial Park straddles the Alberta-Saskatchewan border. The mountain has also been planed off flat, about 1,000 meters in elevation. But the planation surface is covered in rounded rocks made of an extremely hard rock called quartzite. The rocks have circular hammer marks all over them. The rocks were obviously picked up by water and hammered against each other as they were being carried along. But the rocks are so large that the water would have had to have been moving a minimum of 110 kilometers an hour. Now here's the other thing. These rocks didn't come from Alberta. They came from at least 800 kilometers away in Idaho. The rocks probably made that trip in under 10 hours. A wall of water 1,000 meters above sea level, picking up rocks in Idaho, transporting them to Alberta at speeds exceeding 110 kilometers an hour is a global flood. This simply cannot be explained any other way. The evidence for a worldwide flood is profound and overwhelming. The evidence is all around you. You just need to know what to look for. Lastly, when we take a look around the world, we see hundreds of stories, legends, and myths of a worldwide flood in virtually every culture in the world. This is also profound evidence that a great flood did occur within the memory of mankind. One example of one of these flood legends is found on the back of the Canadian $20 bill, an artist's rendition of the Inuit story of Noah and the Ark. This is only one of hundreds of similar stories. Some have suggested that the biblical account of a worldwide flood was actually just copied from the Epic of Gilgamesh, because the Epic of Gilgamesh is older than the Bible. Now wait a minute. Even if it is older, so what? We have literally hundreds of accounts of a massive flood all over the world. The Epic of Gilgamesh is only one of hundreds. Now, if you had seen a report of an event in various newspapers that all reported a similar story, but one newspaper came up before the rest, would you assume that the other newspapers simply copied the first? Well, of course not. Secondly, the account of the flood in the Epic of Gilgamesh has fatal flaws. The boat, as described, is a cube and clearly not seaworthy. Yet, models of Noah's Ark, based on the dimensions provided in the Bible, have proved remarkably stable in wave tests. So is there any other evidence of Noah's flood? We'll be right back with the mailbag. Stay tuned.
What does the Bible say about aliens? Is there life on other planets? What can science tell us about the possibility of aliens? Ian Chuby gives answers to these and many more questions in this fascinating and highly disturbing subject. Looking analytically at the subject, complete with the testimonies of people who claim to have been abducted by aliens. The answers will probably surprise you. In this 1.5-hour lecture, Ian shows that the alleged aliens are a problem and that Jesus is the solution. Order online today at Ian's bookstore.
Mail for me? Ah!
Yep, that's the one. East Vietnamese jumping spider. The venom is so strong that one bite can kill any child and 95% of adults. The surviving 5% typically slip into a coma for 3 to 6 months, only to wake up with permanent paralysis. Ian
M. wrote in from Ottawa. The infamous meteor that killed the dinosaurs. What is the skeptics' evidence of this assertion? And logically, wouldn't a big meteor cause flooding like on a global scale? Perhaps the Earth was hit by a big meteor as a part of the wrath of God, but the real killer of the dinosaurs was the flood. Thanks for writing in, Ian. The question of what killed the dinosaurs is a fun topic which I'll briefly discuss here, but I would encourage viewers to subscribe to my YouTube channel where they can catch bonuses and extras like Crevo Rant number 17 for a fun and funny look at the question of what killed the dinosaurs. I also go into detail in a previous newsletter article here. Now, I've had the privilege of excavating dinosaurs and dinosaur tracks at a number of locations in North America. I've also had the privilege to go and study several dinosaur graves and trackway sites. The typical story we are told is that the dinosaurs were killed when a giant asteroid slammed into the Earth, and the resulting effects killed off the dinosaurs. Now, we are told that the evidence for this impact comes in the form of a rare earth called iridium, which is found in the layer containing the dinosaurs, as well as shocked quartz, tektites, and glass beads found with the dinosaurs. Now, shocked quartz, tektites, and glass beads can be found associated with impact craters produced by the tremendous impact forces caused by the impact of the asteroid. Now, I'm going to steer clear of the majority of problems with this model and focus on some of the basics. First, where's the crater? Many have pointed to the astrobleem known as the Chicxulub crater on the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. I'd first like to point out that that is an interpretation that this circular feature is a crater. It might not even be a crater, but let's go on the assumption that it is a crater. Conventional geologists using conventional radiometric dating methods on the core samples taken at the Chicxulub crater dated the impact as happening 300,000 years before the death of the dinosaurs. Secondly, Heyman et al., dating a hadrosaur leg bone, concluded that this hadrosaur was still alive 700,000 years after the impact. Now, I don't believe these dates. I'm just pointing out that using the evolutionists' own dates, you've got dinosaurs still living 1 million years after the alleged Chicxulub impact. Now, obviously, if that's the case, then said impact had nothing to do with the demise of the dinosaurs. Furthermore, no iridium has been found associated with the Chicxulub crater, and iridium has been found in layers both above and below the layer of dinosaur remains. We also know now that iridium is expelled in vast quantities by volcanoes. Shocked quartz can be produced by an asteroid impact, yes, but it can also be produced in a number of other ways. For example, there is quite a bit of evidence that the continents divided rapidly, not over millions of years, but perhaps days or weeks. The continental crust contains a lot of quartz, and thus impacting continents can also produce things like shocked quartz. Now, if the shocked quartz found with the dinosaurs was from an impact, then there should be a higher concentration of it the closer you get to the impact. Instead, the quartz is very evenly distributed throughout the world. The glass beads found are simply silica, a form of quartz, which was melted and rapidly cooled, probably in water. Tektites are a really nifty looking form of melted quartz that cooled while falling through the air. Again, these glass beads and tektites, if they came from an impact, should have a higher density closer to the impact. Instead, they too are evenly distributed, indicating they did not come from a point source. Notice, though, that these can all be produced by violent volcanoes. But the real evidence as to what killed the dinosaurs comes from the dinosaurs themselves. Now, even though I disagree with their views and interpretation, I highly recommend that you visit the Royal Tyrrell Museum in Drumheller, Alberta. As you tour throughout the museum, pay close attention to the interpretive plaques. Over and over and over again, as you read about the dinosaurs on display, they say things like, "This dinosaur drowned. This herd of dinosaurs was killed trying to cross a raging river. This dinosaur must have drowned in a lake." Over and over again, we see that water killed the dinosaurs. Now, why would they say that? It's because that's what the evidence shows. When we find the dinosaurs, we find them typically ripped apart and buried together with fossil clams that were buried alive. When we find dinosaurs relatively intact, they are found in what is called the death pose, with their heads pulled back, evidence of drowning and rapid burial. All the evidence points to the dinosaurs being drowned in a massive flood, but this was no meandering river. For example, this is a map of the Morrison Formation, a formation containing untold numbers of fossil dinosaurs in which I have actually excavated dinosaurs. The formation covers 10 states and 3 Canadian provinces. This was no river or small flash flood. This was a massive flood on the scale of a global flood. It was Noah's flood that killed the dinosaurs that we find. Well, that's it for this week's show. Thanks for watching, and remember, if you're catching us on YouTube, you can share this show with your friends on TwitFace Plus using the convenient share button down below. You can send in your questions and comments a number of ways. I'm your host, Ian Juby, reminding you of the words of our Creator, the Lord Jesus Christ, who said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but through me." We'll see you next Genesis week as we pursue the truth together.
We need your support to help keep this program on the air. You can help by making a tax-deductible donation to Core Ottawa, Canada North Post Office Box 72075, Ottawa, Ontario, K2K2P4. You can also sign up for Ian's newsletter detailing current research and news items at ianjuby.org.